Tonight I'm going to be talking to you about Hartford's early suburban milieu. I say this because it's kind of this organic creation of a suburban culture within Hartford. And I'm going to challenge you about the way we think about cities and the way we think about Hartford's history in doing this. So I start off with this idea of the city and the urban. I'm going to try and engage you early on after I go through a few introductory slides. So to provide some context to this, I think about this idea that we mourn, essentially, the passing of the most recent past, the city of the most recent past. So I'll show you a photo image in a little while. But typically, we mourn the passing of Hartford of the 1950s, the era of this building and G. Fox, this idea of that's when Hartford was a great urban place. I'm going to challenge your thought process on that tonight. Risaldo had this idea of the imperialist nostalgia, where people mourn the passing of what they themselves have transformed. And I think this is critical and key when we think about cities and urban places. So through nostalgia, we develop a kind of idealized vision of the past, that Hartford was this era of the 1950s and the greatness of Main Street here. We tend not to consider, understand, or mourn the passing of the city that came before it, that there was actually a different city here before that era that we focus so much on. We also tend to tell and understand urban history in a well-packaged story, especially in the context of suburbia. You know, it's post-1945, it is federal housing policy, it's automobiles, it's the interstate highway system, it's segregation, it's white flight, and so forth and so on. And we arrive at today in this world that is chaotic and crazy, and we've got suburban sprawl and everything's awful. That's the way suburban history is often told. But if we look back earlier, let's go back 100 years before 1945. Let's go back 150 years before 1945, and let's see what was going on in Hartford, and that's essentially what I'll do. So Sir Nigel Thrift, who's an English geographer, has essentially challenged the way we understand urban history. And in doing so, he's stated that many authors are now beginning to believe that our world may not be so different from the world that came before. And I put myself in that camp. I actually think we're living quite similarly 100, 150 years ago. And that's essentially what tonight's lecture is about. So the picture on the left is a 1930s aerial image of the city. And in some ways, this is the Hartford that we mourn the passing of. And we can see in it the Travelers Tower and the various tall buildings in Central Row there around it. And in some ways, that's really, if we look at this block here, this is our most urban block. And it still exists, mostly in this form today, with these two buildings gone. But I want to point you back, and behind it, we have the old Front Street neighborhood. And of course, we know the story there. The highways were run, and it was destroyed. And we mourn the passing of it essentially with this over here, the construction of Constitution Plaza in the 1960s. But let me move to some specific properties. Let's go to the 1700s in the Old Statehouse, which is hidden in the shadows here. It's set back far from the street. It's not built to the curb just as these buildings are. It has a lawn. And let's come down here to 1842 in the Wodsworth Athenaeum. And we also see a significant setback. And the additions that come later, 1905, 1915, on the Wadsworth. And we see deep setbacks too. And let's even go to City Hall. And we also see a deep setback there. From a historical perspective, this should be saying something to us. That maybe this isn't the way it was earlier on. Here's an image of 1916 Hartford, and it's before the towers come. You know, this is the first phase of the Travelers Tower, but we don't have the tower over it. The tall buildings that end up on Central Row are missing from it. And we don't really think that much of this city. We don't mourn the passing of this city because we didn't really know it, right? I'm not sure anyone in this room was alive in 1960. So it just existed. So I want to get some data very quickly to provide context. When we say cities, we usually think of big places, right? But if we go back to 1800, Hartford itself was only 5,000 persons. The metropolitan region, or how we define it today, was only about 92,000 persons. Let me put this in context. New York City in 1800 was about 100,000 persons. By 1880, it was 2 million. Hartford by 1850 is still only 13,000 persons. It's not some great big city. It's actually kind of a small village. A town like Stafford Springs, where I live today, is 15,000 persons. It's actually larger than Hartford was in 1850. Skip ahead, we do see tremendous growth between 1850 and 1950 over the next 100 years. The city goes to probably topped out at 180. But in these charts here, so this is 1850, and this is the period of the core of our industrial revolution. And we arrive essentially at 1945. And this is the start of what I will refer to as mass suburbanization. I essentially did this data, Hartford's percent of total population of the region defined as the MSA today, 57 communities that make it up. The region made up in this one as the streetcar era, the 21 communities that were tied together by our suburban streetcar system. You could get as far as Stafford Springs, Enfield, out to Collinsville, and almost down to Cromwell. Hartford is the CROG region, sorry for the typo there. That's Hartford and the 34 communities of the Capital Region Council of Government, and Hartford as the county, the 29 towns that make up Hartford County. It's interesting that they all follow the same trajectory. The fact is, Hartford never was super central, that there was always a larger, if we look down here, a much larger region than there was a central city. And they all decline at the same point in time, right? Or Hartford centrality declines in all cases. So here, once again, 1850, this is Hartford and the county. Hartford on the bottom line, the county on the blue. It's not actually 1945 that we see suburban expansion happen. The county starts to explode actually back here around 1910. If we do it as the MSA, Hartford 1850, the region 1850, and then we come forward, this is 1945 again, the giant growth, yes, huge metropolitan growth in this period, and a contraction in Hartford in this period. But that regional growth really starts, once again, 1900, 1910-ish, far before where we typically see it. So the urban and the suburban, conceptualizing differences and understanding history. Stay focused on the left-hand side for now. I would just want to ask you a question. I do this with my students. It's kind of like Psychology 101 and free association. If I say city, what words come to your mind? Anyone shout something out. So I say city, you think buildings. Downtown, population, culture, commercial shopping, crowded. Yeah, a lot of people. So actually, I'm just gonna put words in your mouth. I'll take all those things and say there's a lot of things going on in the city, and what we're really talking about is density, right? Lots of people, lots of buildings, lots of stuff. If I say suburbs or suburbia, what comes to mind? Space, small, lawns, uniform, country, land. Okay, let's stop with those. We're going to talk more about those as I move along. So essentially, in the 1950s, there was a bunch of writers in America, sociologists and stuff, that started writing about a suburban way of life, that maybe the suburban way of life was different than the urban way of life. And we're going to talk more about that as we move along. And I already gave you kind of the post-1945 narrative of suburbia. It's this kind of, mass exodus to the suburbs and the abandonment and decline of the city. But if we think about these things in the context of urban forms, then we start to see a historical narrative on how the suburbs came to be. So the ideas of the house and yard did not enter the nation's consciousness through the efforts of any person or individual, that there were specific persons or a large number of persons, including Catherine Beecher, who lived here in Hartford, who founded her school in 1823 in Hartford, her female seminary, and who was a leader in Christian domesticity, or the domestic household, the domestic economy. And we also then see Fishman say that the suburban ideal in the mid-19th century America came from a group of publicists. If I go back up to the bullet above, that the American suburban vision was actually crafted between 1840 and 1875. And then post-1945, it becomes this mass suburbia. But I want to look at actually before 1840 in the context of Hartford, because that's when, for me, things become most interesting. So the suburban ideal and forms, what was identified there as the American suburban ideal, really include the idea of domesticity, this kind of the family lifestyle that was being promoted by the evangelicals of the time, the picturesque natural landscapes, and picturesque being those landscapes improved by human intervention. The Hudson River landscape artists were known for improving upon the sceneries they were seeing, that essentially being the picturesque. The country cottage or villa, and ornamental gardens and lawns. You guys said different versions of these actually in your answers on suburbia. If we look here, Riverside, Illinois, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, who was born here in Hartford. That's a 1868 early attempt at a suburban community, following all these principles. Andrew Jackson Downing, 1841, writes a book on landscape architecture and promotes the country cottage, the Gothic country cottage. And we see a suburban style home, a modern one today, at the bottom there. For the suburbs in general, this idea that it's separate, it's beyond the edge of the city, that it's a blending of city and country, that was Frederick Law Olmsted's concept, and that there's the division of home and work, and that there's also some type of suburban way of life. We'll keep on coming back to that. So an early suburban milieu, let's go back to Daniel Wodsworth. We've all probably heard his name, we probably don't know much about him. His father was very key in the revolutionary days of America, helped establish our finance and banking system. They were an extremely wealthy family, and Daniel never had to work a day in his life. He lived off of basically his father's money. And due to that, he was one of America's first great philanthropists. He traveled to England in the 1780s with his father, and he liked what he saw in the kind of English manor landscapes. He bought a bunch of books on English landscaping, and he brought them back here. They ultimately ended up in the Wadsworth Athenaeum when he opened it, when it opened in 1844. Out on Talcott Mountain, there's a street called Montevideo. It's a private drive. If you're down in the valley looking up from Route 44, all the houses you see to the left of the roadway, 44, are on Montevideo. And John Trumbull, who was an early famous American painter, early attempts at landscape paintings, and one of the three individuals who discovered Thomas Cole in the founding of the Hudson River Landscape Schools. He paints Montevideo in 1792. And then this is a sketch actually done by Daniel Wadsworth himself. I'm guessing timeline on this is the late 18 teens. We see his cottage to the left. It was Gothic in design. It lasted all the way up until the 1990s. Unfortunately, it was demolished then. He built a viewing tower. This is the first of 3 towers that existed on the mountain. And the U-Blind Tower today is the 3rd. And it was about a quarter mile, the U-Blind Tower is about a quarter mile north of where this viewing tower was. We also see some imagery here of a woman in the foreground, a girl, in kind of this feminization of space or the domestication of space, and a nice pond on the property. Off the back of the house is the cliff, basically 1,000 feet down into the valley with these spectacular views. And here we see this picture. Once again, we have a woman in the foreground, and this is Thomas Cole's painting of 1828 of Montevideo, the seat of Daniel Wadsworth. There was a professor at Yale by the name of Benjamin Silliman, and he was good friends with Wadsworth. And in 1818, the 2 of them decided to go on a walk from Hartford to Quebec. People used to do that. We don't really do that anymore, do we? No. They started their walk at Montevideo. In the first chapter in a book that was published in 1819 by Benjamin Silliman called Remarks on a Walk from Hartford to Quebec, the first chapter is called Montevideo, and he writes about Daniel Wadsworth's estate. And in that, he says a lot of things that are impressive, but this line jumped out at me. National character often receives its peculiar cast from natural scenery. Thus, the natural scenery is intimately connected with taste, moral feelings, utility, and instruction. And he basically says that that enables us to understand the peculiarities of the beautiful and grand scenery of Montevideo. And he goes on to say, quite without a parallel in America, and probably very few in the world. He recognizes this as an exceptional location. So exceptional that Wadsworth gets Thomas Cole to paint it for him. And what we see when we look back in the suburban histories of important things in suburban history, we actually find that Montevideo is missed, even though it shows up in the most important text. 1841, Catherine Beecher's Treaty on Domesticity kind of marked the starting point of the American suburban vision. She actually used Montevideo as an example in it. The Gothic cottage, Daniel Wadsworth's estate in the vicinity of, and Catherine and Harriet with their students from the girls' school are documented as venturing out there, doing the 7-mile walk and spending time out at Montevideo. Andrew Jackson Downing with his treatise in 1841 on landscape design also references Montevideo. And he says it's worthy of commendation as its evidence a good deal of beauty and its grounds. And it is one of the most tasteful in the state. The interesting thing is, Wadsworth designed it between 1805 and 1810. It's far before most of the other estates that Downing is actually referencing. We also see in other literature that Clark, 1976, recognizes that Gothic was the ultimate in the Christian home. So of course Catherine Beecher was promoting it. And possibly that Wadsworth's Gothic estate was the earliest in New England. Olmsted's also documented his playing as a child out at Montevideo. And he misses it when he's actually working for a short time in New York City when he's around 20 years old. This image on the top left comes from Catherine Beecher's treatise of the estate. It's actually interesting. This is the guest house. This isn't Wadsworth's actual house. And we see another image of it from around the same time, 1830, that was painted. Just to point out a few things, we kind of have the pastoral with the animals. We have lawns. We have some landscaping. There is something suburban-esque about it. And in suburban history, there's this idea that the suburban starts in what were known as borderland estates of the wealthy. And this is a Google image here, downtown Hartford. And if we go out, essentially, this is Route 44 coming over the mountain. This is the West Hartford Reservoir. And the pond that was in view in some of those images is still there, and there is a very large home that is actually, I believe, for sale right now for $19 million if you wish to purchase it. It's been for sale for about 6 years now. No one's bought it yet. And the price hasn't reduced. So I want to come inward to the city now and look at Frederick Law Olmsted and Horace Bushnell as providing some context of, can we look at some of these landscapes and design features within the city? Olmsted was born in 1822 in a house known as the Dodd House that was on College Street. College Street today is Capitol Avenue. It was called College Street because Trinity College sat on the location of where the state capitol is. This is where the Bushnell Theater would be today. This is the Department of Commerce building that's being renovated, and these are those awful parking lots everyone always complains about. And the Dodd House was right there. I think this picture is the Dodd House. Connecticut Historical Society has the photo listed as the Dodd House, but it says it's on Affleck Street. So still trying to pin that down, but I think this is the house, and this is the place of Wodsworth, of Frederick Law Olmsted's birth. This is 1845. Olmsted was born in 1822. His family moved off of College Street in 1836. So he's not living on the street at this time. But we see an article in the Hartford Courant in 1845 that says there is more taste displayed in building here than has been formerly in Boston and that vicinity, nor are the people quite so careful about room. I would define that as space. There are very great advantages to build here, and they have been improved by gentlemen of taste and property. Almost every house has what may be called a garden, room enough for flowers and shrubberies. And here we see a painting of the same year, 1845, looking from College Street up to Trinity College in the background. And we actually see a nice little gentleman actually doing yard work in his front lawn. If we go back to this map, that gentleman is probably standing somewhere around here, about 4 or 5 houses up from where Olmsted was. If we go back to this map, which is 1850, you can see that these are all single-family houses on individual lots. Bushnell then Olmsted's family moves over to Ann Street in 36, but Horace Bushnell arrives here in 1833, and he buys a house on Ann Street. This is his daughter writing about him, and it has a small yard and a noble oak in the rear. In the spring, it was a positive pleasure for the minister with his farming habits to find himself outdoors digging in his little garden. So even Horace Bushnell enjoyed working in his garden. And in 1836, Olmsted's father purchases the house at what I believe is actually 34, not 3 Ann Street. And the Olmsted and Bushnell families were next door neighbors. On this map, you see 2 side-by-side properties, J. Olmsted, J. Olmsted. One was the Bushnells, one was the Olmsteds. When Bushnell moves in 1840, we see down here on this bullet that the Olmsteds bought the Bushnells' house. So we know those are their 2 houses. Horace Bushnell was ridiculed for his choice of a site in the fields. He moved outwards, as people said, and on a street that was yet open and that he christened as Winthrop Street. Winthrop Street, or the location of his house today, would be around where the RPI, the Rensselaer Polytechnic building, is over just north of the ballpark. And when Bushnell moved out there were no other houses there. He opened up that street and placed his house. And we see an 1850s article, 10 years later, after he does this in 1840, we see this article called The Growth of the City, and it talks about the expansion of this neighborhood. So even then, people were ridiculed for moving towards suburbia. This is to provide some context going back to the Olmsted Street. The top left house is the J.W. Bull house. It was on Ann Street, just 2 doors down from the Olmsted properties, as you see here. And it was constructed in 1841. So that gives you context of what Ann Street maybe looked like when the Olmsteds moved there. 1 block over on High Street, we see this house. It's an 1860s photo, but the house also probably constructed late 1830s, early 1840s. And that is the home of, what's her name? Sigourney. Her first name's escaping me. Lydia, that's it, thank you. The C for her husband. Interestingly enough, she wrote a poem and published a poem about Montevideo. But let's move on here. In 1840, we actually see an article in the Hartford Courant that's talking about horticulture in the High Street garden. And it says, if the admiration of the beautiful things of nature has a tendency to soften and refine character, the culture of them is still more powerful and abiding influence. The toil, the hurry, and speculation, the sudden which marks our times. That actually sounds very much like today, don't we talk about that? These cell phones and technology and the talk of autonomous automobiles, the toil and the hurry, life speeding up, it's very awful. What's the toil and hurry that's going on in 1840 Hartford? Huh? Railroad arrives in 1839. I'm quite confident that's the reference here. Then goes on to say, and if he who devotes his leisure and culture of the works of nature benefits himself, he who beautifies a garden for eye of the community is surely a public benefactor. He furnishes pure ailments of the taste, which refine character and multiplies simple pleasures. This refining character keeps on kicking me back to Silliman's words in 1819. That national scenery influences national character. Oh, looking from the west, this is the new train station. This is an 1864 lithograph image, and where the train station sits today. And we see this undeveloped area here, which would be around where the bars and parking lots and federal building are there, north and east of the train station. That is the High Street Garden. And we see another, this is from the same article, we see another article in 1843 that was first published in the Horticulturalist, or the Magazine of Horticulture, and then published in the Hartford Courant. And it says, we call upon Dr. Bull, whose beautiful gardens situated on High Street. The grounds laid out in the picturesque style. E.W. Bull, the next article, 1845, ornamenting and beautifying Hartford. And then 6, an article on the garden. The High Street Garden combines a remarkable degree and charms of nature and art, are found to have refining effect on national character. See, we keep on coming back to this idea of national character. If you start thinking about the social cultural movements of the time, temperance in 1800, suffrage, abolition, these were all about the first 3 or 4 generations after the founding of our country, trying to define who we were gonna be as a country. This idea of national character is really significant and important, and Harriet Beecher Stowe's writing about it in the 1860s. We'll get to that. So, Taste of Hartford, 1853. The taste exhibits itself in almost every suburban garden in the city. This taste in flowers owns its origins, once again, the Dr. Bull, to create this very lovely vegetable beauty and introduce new flowers and shrubs. Bull's equated as a counterpart or colleague of the influential Downing, who I already spoke of. We taste continually pop up. And then it says parents are beginning to appreciate how powerful the influence of home may be increased over their children by the beauty and loveliness which art and taste in flowers and trees. The spots where these new dwellings are erected have been well chosen and the picturesque studied in their embellishment. We actually see kind of the blending of Catherine Beecher's domesticity here with landscape design and horticulture, in that there's these, parents are starting to recognize how important these qualities are. This is an 1877 lithograph, I believe done by Jacob Wiederman. And we see this area now from the other angle. This would have been the High Street Garden, but it's now developed. Bull dies, Ebenezer Bull dies in 1845. Most of those articles you were reading were in reaction to his death and recognizing his contribution to the city. There was a movement in 1846 to purchase his property and turn it into a park, predating Bushnell Park. And nothing ever came of it. And at some point, it was purchased by someone else. Oh, we'll get to that. Ultimately, it ends up being developed later on. This is the interesting thing about who this Mr. Bull is. Turns out he's the brother of Mary Ann Bull, Frederick Law Olmsted's stepmother, who raised Olmsted from the age of 5. Frederick Law Olmsted, describing a suburb outside of Liverpool, most historians point to this event in 1850 as what got Olmsted interested in suburban designs. But if you read what Olmsted actually said, it may seem an uninteresting landscape, but I gaze upon it with great emotion, so great I wonder at it. Such a scene I had never looked upon before, and yet was in all of its parts as familiar to me as my native valley. He recognized what he was seeing in this experience that everyone says was actually unique. I'm not sure it was. Just as today, in vogue neighborhoods move around, the Olmsted Ann Street neighborhood actually goes into decline. And we see the next emerging neighborhood in the 1850s, and it is the Washington Street neighborhood. And look at the language from the current. But the cry still for more house room and more accommodations. The wealthy must retreat still further to the country and give up their present residence to those whose businesses demand and need it. They're moving outward to give up room for commerce. Bill will like this next thing in the middle here. I didn't highlight it, but it says, bring the artifices who bring us our prosperity. This is 1850, 3 years after Horace Bushnell wrote Prosperity, Our Duty. I'm sure there's influence there in this. And then Washington Street, those whom the expansion of this part of the city have driven from its crowded lower streets have erected their ornamental residences, and those beautiful hills seem like one continued garden. We see an image up here from the 1870s of one of those stately houses with a horse and carriage in front of it, the automobile of the time, basically. And we can see it on the map here, where we see all these large properties. If you drive Washington Avenue today, you still see some of the remnants of those properties. There's still a couple of them tucked away there. And this is an 1894 image of the corner of Church and Ann Street, a dilapidated building, the decline of what was once Olmsted's emerging middle class, beautiful neighborhood. That neighborhood already in decline. It would find a new life in the years to come, but at this point, it's in decline. So we see this moving and shifting, which then we arrive at Nook Farm. Oh, Mark Twain and Nook Farm. The Beechers and the Twains. Can't escape them. So Fishman, a suburban historian, explains that the true suburb, however, is more than the edge of the city inhabited by largely by the middle class. Basically, that's what I've been telling you, right? Streets within the city inhabited by the middle class. Then it must embody in its design and marriage of town and country, Olmsted words, a distinct zone set apart from the solid rows of city streets and rural fields. On the left-hand side, we have Llewellyn Park, New Jersey, 1856, a design by Andrew Jackson Davis as one of possibly the earliest suburban community. And then Olmsted's famed Riverside on the right-hand side. In 1853, John Hooker, husband of Isabella Hooker, with his brother and in-law, Francis Gillette, purchased Nook Farm, a tract of 100 acres. The farm lay just outside the western city limits and is still in portions heavily wooded. Its trees and knolls and its winding stream made it the ideal residential site. That's Andrews, who wrote the book Nook Farm in 1950, speaking there. I dug up a letter from the Gillette archives dated October 27th, 1852, where he explains his decision that I might have an occupation and home conveniently near city privileges while I reside in the garden. This is the interesting thing. Hooker and his wife Isabel, who's a beacher, we have another beacher in this story, lived in Farmington, a farming community. Gillette and his wife lived in Bloomfield, also a farming community. They chose to move inward, not outward, to the suburban fringe of Hartford and settle Nook Farm. 1877 image of Nook Farm here from that same lithograph again. This is the Harriet Beecher Stowe house. This is the Mark Twain house. And we see kind of a residential suburban community. From the first, the Hookers looked upon Nook Farm as a small society of their very own. And as the city pushed westward from the river, the owners were able to subdivide desirable land among congenial persons whom they wished to have as neighbors. Wow, that sounds like suburban exclusionary, doesn't it? Especially those deed restrictions in their deeds that, prevented sale to the Irish. But we see a lot of similarities here, right? This is no different than maybe we think of Avon or Farmington today. Someone once cursed me for saying that. How dare I put Mark Twain in this situation? As early as 1855, there's an editorial that says Nook Farm had so many desirable locations for buildings. Hooker has a beautiful cottage, and Perkins' grounds are laid out in a neat and tasteful manner. Nook Farm can't be beat for desirable locations. Oh, Perkins is married to Mary Beecher. We have another Beecher here who falls into the story. And then Mark Twain. And we all know this quote, most famous Twain quote about Hartford. Of all the beautiful cities it has been my fortune to see, this one is chief. Everywhere the eye turns is blessed with a vision of refreshing green. You do not know what beauty is if you have not been here. I bet you none of you knew it was actually the first and last sentence of a paragraph. And we see his house, nice ornamental lawn, and so forth, right? Well, what's that paragraph say? It's a city of 40,000 inhabitants composed almost entirely of dwelling houses. No shingled shape affairs stood on end and packed together like a deck of cards, read townhouses, but massive private hotels scattered along broad, straight streets from 50 all the way up to 200 yards apart. Each house sits in the midst of about an acre of green grass or flower beds or ornamental shrubbery, guarded on all sides by the trimmest hedges of arborvitae and by files of huge forest trees that cast shadows like thunderclouds. Some of these stately dwellings are almost buried from sight in parks and forests of these noble trees. This is his second visit to Hartford in 1868. He's not describing a city here. There's no way he's describing a city here. And that's his fence in the foreground here. And this is across the street at the corner of Gillette Street. The photo, though, is later. It's 1899. But here we have one of those massive private hotels that lines the streets of Hartford. It's not a hotel. He's using hotel to actually describe the size of these single-family residential homes. And Harriet Beecher Stowe's son, leading Hartford families were abandoning the core city and building lavish estates on the fringe of town. Harriet Beecher Stowe, who had settled permanently in Hartford in 1863, noted that while other cities developed dirty suburbs, Hartford could boast elegant, kept country places near enough to the city to enjoy the far enough in the country to have all its quietude and repose. Harriet's first house was actually built on Nook Farm and on Capitol Avenue. It's there. It was called Oakham. She sold it to Gillette, who was doing a speculative real estate development of suburban homes with a partner in 1870. And that's when she purchased the house we now know as the Harriet Beecher Stowe house. It already existed. This is from that 1877 lithograph. This is the location. That is her house shown here. Gillette cut in Laurel Street. He put in the bridge to cross the rail, cut in Laurel Street, put in the bridge to cross the river over the Park Street, and he cut in Woodbine Road, and he built single-family homes that were affordable to working men. This is where history gets muddy, and this is the point I wanted to make before. What was built on that site afterwards? All those houses were wiped away, and it was the Underwood typewriter factory that was put there. This is the Hartford we mourn, right? The industrial greatness of the 1950s, but we have no idea what actually came before it. Single-family houses for working men. A suburban community, not an urban industrial community. We also like to blame the automobile for the death of the city in '84 being put through the city, and then Etna having all these parking spaces in that dead space under the highway. Look at the photo. All the cars were there before the highway came. They were the parking lots for Underwood Factory. The highway didn't remove any buildings in this location. The buildings were removed before the highway got there to make way for parking for Underwood. We can see these landscapes across the city. This is Farmington Avenue in 1889 at Oxford Street, right near the West Hartford border. These are large Victorian homes set back 35 feet from the front yard. I've often heard people complain about the deep setbacks on Farmington Ave, that zoning in the 1920s created them. No. They were established in the Victorian area during the streetcar suburbs when these homes were built, and zoning stayed consistent with them, and the areas transitioned to a mix of commercial and residential. We can follow Farmington Ave right out into West Hartford to what we now know as West Hill. And when you crest West Hill today, on the right-hand side, there's a stone wall. That stone wall is from the 1860s. That house was built by Cornelius Vanderbilt. He got sick and never lived in it, then turned it over to his son. His son moved in, married a girl from Hartford, lived there for 9 years, sold it to a developer who then tore it down and built that West Hill neighborhood that we now know. The stone wall is the only remaining evidence of it. But we can see this suburban McMansion expansion. Much more than McMansion though, isn't it? It's a Vanderbilt. So the suburban way of life, Bushnell was challenging Protestantism of the time. I like to think of it, Timothy Dwight from Yale at the turn of the century, and then Lyman Beecher. For them, their Protestantism, their evangelicalism was about fire and brimstone. We were all sinners and we were gonna die no matter what we did, right? But for this emerging middle class in the mid-1800s, that really wasn't acceptable. People didn't want to be sinners and have a fate of death for their sins, cast to purgatory. So Bushnell was really writing what I like to joke around was a kinder, gentler Protestantism for the emerging middle class. And one of the things he did was he taught us how to play. This author here says, the true object of human existence, Bushnell argued, is to get beyond work and engage in even more refined and creative forms of play. And we see Andrews writing about the Nook Farm community in the 1870s and 1880s. It's about that period of time of Twain. The children of the prosperous class formed a social set seeking its amusements away from home. In the winter, down to the river for ice skating and racing, or to the rink for roller skating. Sledding was available closer to home, for the best residential sections were hilly. Many families owned sleds, and well-chaperoned sleighing parties jingled out Farmington Ave. In the summer, they concentrated on sports, hanging around the ballpark, admiring the professional athletes and attending the games, or playing in sandlot contests themselves. Boys and girls alike, as well as their parents, played tennis tournaments arranged by the tennis clubs. I see a soccer mom zooming around in a horse-drawn carriage, pre-automobile. This isn't very different than today. It actually seems quite similar if you just say she was driving around in a Dodge Caravan rather than a sleigh ride going out Farmington Ave. So Harriet Beecher Stowe, when she started building her house in 1862 in Hartford, started writing in serial form for Harper's a piece called her Home Papers, House and Home Papers. It was later published in 1865 as a book. She takes on the male persona as the head of household in this book. And I love the opening paragraph of the book. I believe that infirmity is the love of getting things cheap. Understand me now, I don't mean love of getting cheap things. Really sensible people are quite superior to that sort of cheapness. But those fortunate accidents which put within the power of man things of really good and valuable for half or a third of the value that mortal virtue and resolution can withstand. This book is cast as domesticity and as the domestic economy and the female role in the household. But when you actually read it cover to cover, it's really a how-to manual on how to be a middle-class housewife, how to shop and find deals. And her favorite thing, as she's writing about right there, is thrift. It's kind of interesting. Anthropologists, sociologists still write about our need for thrift today. David Brooks has written about the concept of thrift. And she talks about here, economy is the science of proportion. Whether particular purchases is extravagant depends mainly on the income in which it comes from. There's other sections where it talks about their daughter and the neighbor's kids, and those girls have 3 hats, and that's so lavish. And the father, who's Harriet's voice, is saying, well, I bet you, these neighbors talk about my girls and their 2 hats as being too lavish. Kind of the same things. It's really a book about conspicuous consumption, very similar to what we think of today. I love this passage about the sons. Artie and Tom brought home their college friends who straight away took root there and seemed to fancy themselves as part of us. The girls, all their courting and flirting that were to be done for their arena, the ample variety of surfaces presented by our parlor, the family room, which with sofas, screens, and lounges. But then she goes on in other places, talk in ways that bring me back to Silliman and that idea of national character. The class that do their own work are the strongest and most numerous. Those are people who don't have servants, this emergent middle class. Quite as well cultivating a class as any other, they are an anomaly in our country, the distinctive feature of the new society that was building up here. And if we are to accomplish our national destiny, that class must increase rather than diminish. America, the only country where there is a class of women who may be described as ladies who do their own work. In England, there's a very well understood expression that people do not dress or live above their station. In America, none will admit that they have any particular station or that can live above it. Wow. That whole idea of us being equal. We don't recognize station. We can all be the same. And if their children have 3 hats, well, damn it, we can too, right? Not much has changed. Isabella Hooker and her husband in their backyard. A family, I don't know who they are. They're from Hartford, but they're in their backyard. Afternoon of croquet. Look at those cyclists on the high wheels. We have a lot of those zooming around today, don't we? Not the high wheels, but the cyclists. And this is a couple, actually not a couple, it's a mom and her son in the backyard on Sigourney Street. And look at all those cars either being loaded or unloaded in 1916 onto a train in the north end of Hartford. So we arrive at this place. Ooh, I got ahead of myself, I forgot. I like these images. 2 men, 2 women out on a Sunday drive. They're actually kind of poor. They're a troubled family. They get arrested a lot. They can't hold down jobs. They have alcohol problems. The guy on the right in the center picture is my grandfather. A year before he passes away. That's his brother on the left. They scraped their money together to buy a car together. That's my grandmother on the left in the left-hand photo, and that's my dad as a little child. See how proud they are about this car they got. And this is 1938. And that's my great-grandfather. At the beginning of Franklin Ave, near Hartford Hospital, toiling in his little yard. In 1940s, the family would actually buy a lot and build a home, finally out in Bloomfield. And that was with the combination of 3 incomes going in on that house. So suburban and urban historians often claim or dismiss or even disparage our modern American suburb as a small private island with the backyard functioning as a wholesome, family-oriented, and reclusive place. But I think in doing so, they miss that this suburban lifestyle was firmly established over 100 years before we actually think it started. It was life. In Hartford, urban before it was urban. And the city we mourn the passing of is not the city it was originally. It's possibly the first suburban city. I think this may be the cultural hearth of the suburban ideal. Still working to pin it down in full. But I end with my favorite photo. It's Mark Twain, his wife, 3 girls, and the dog on their back porch in their backyard, enjoying their domestic family life. Oh, and if you take a close look at the Mark Twain house, there is no front door. Well, there is. It faces inwards towards Harriet Beecher Stowe's house. It doesn't face the street. Talk about turning your back to the public and turning yourself inward to the community. And that's what it was, the Nook Farm community. They got to subdivide lots and allow the building of houses with those who they most wanted to associate themselves with. And Twain arrives in Hartford. That piece we read from him with the famous quote comes from 1868. It was published as an article in the newspaper in San Francisco. But when you read it, you can tell he's experiencing something he hasn't seen before, and he's traveled the world. And he fell in love with it, chose to stay here. He chose to build his house here 2 years later. Why? There's other passages where he talks about these great laws where you need to get permission if you're gonna build. So that if your neighbor is going to build a shingle-shaped affair that's gonna harm your value, the lord of the manor next door can say no, and government can stop it. Twain didn't like government. I'd put him kind of maybe in a libertarian context. Hands off, right? He always mocked it. Well, at the end of the day, he was so thankful for those government regulations that would protect his $100,000 investment in 1870 into his house. He chose a place with other houses similar to his in a lifestyle that he wanted to live. For me as a planner, this means we have a lot more to understand about our cities. It means we have a history that we, for whatever reason, are unwilling to explore, unwilling to recognize. That the suburban may have actually come before the urban, or at least in the sense of Hartford, it did. There's a reason why Wodsworth Athenaeum is set well back from the street. Daniel Wadsworth was early in on the whole suburban picturesque design, that they wanted this space, this vegetative beauty. So I'll end there and take any questions that you have.